Hello and welcome to another edition of Coffee Talk with immigration attorney Brian D. Lerner. In this particular episode, we're going to talk about the affidavit of support requirements. It may seem honestly like a little bit of a dry subject, one that doesn't have a lot of flair to it, but the reality is that the affidavit of support requirements can make it so that the person, the beneficiary, might not be able to come into the United States. The whole process, after years of waiting, might be denied. Also, if you know some of the ins and outs of the affidavit of support or the I-864 requirements, it might make it so that whereas initially it seems like you don't qualify or won't be able to obtain the requirements for the affidavit of support, that you might actually be able to. Now, just so you know, let's go into a little bit the policy or the reasons that the affidavit of support exists. Well, first of all, there's lots of different ways that somebody is inadmissible to the U.S., meaning that they're not supposed to come to the U.S. Based upon various reasons, or they're ineligible based upon various reasons. So let's say, for example, they commit a crime, or they have some infectious disease and so forth. So all these are ways that they cannot come into the U.S. unless, for example, a waiver is done, which I have lots of videos on those subjects. But the subject of today, the affidavit of support requirement, that is to satisfy the public charge ground of inadmissibility. Now let's pretend that somebody is petitioned by their spouse or parent or whatever it is, and finally the visa number becomes current and they are able to come into the United States. Well, one thing that the officer needs to look at is whether or not the sponsor, which again is the parent or the spouse, the U.S. citizen or lawful permanent resident, makes enough money so that the beneficiary, the person who's coming in, won't have to go on government assistance when they're here. And if they can't properly show that, then they, being the consular officer, or if they're trying to adjust in the U.S., the immigration officer, will then show or deny the petition, saying that the person is inadmissible because they are likely to become a public charge in the United States and therefore denied. Okay, so what the affidavit of support really does is it shows that the sponsor, or we'll get into it in a little while, the joint sponsor or household helper, immigrant, will make sufficient amount of money, over 125% of the poverty requirements, so that this element is met. And while there are some exceptions to that, that's the general rule. So there's a poverty chart which lists what to the dollar the poverty requirements are, meaning that, if somebody has, two dependents and a spouse, then, if you have a household size of 4, for example, then the 100% they need to make would be, I'll throw a figure like 24,220, and then you have to multiply that, so you get 125% of that. And if that's the case, then the sponsor needs to make above the 125%, unless they're in the armed services, of which it's just 100%. And then we go from there. And then they've met the requirement. So, if the sponsor makes more than 125% of the necessary poverty requirements, then there's not an issue. It goes from there. Now, the question then becomes, what is the consequences of it? Well, what the affidavit of support is, it's really a contract. It is a contract between the sponsor and the government that if the beneficiary does go on government assistance within the next 10 years, then essentially the government can recoup that money from the sponsor. So, when you're, for example, if you don't make enough and you're looking for a joint sponsor, then the joint sponsor essentially is jointly and severally liable for the debt along with the sponsor, and the government can go after either one of you to recoup that money. So the time limits that it is for would be the 10 years, or until the beneficiary becomes a U.S. citizen, or if you subtract, and this is sort of an interesting issue, but if the beneficiary has worked and has evidence of working through the Social Security office, then they can actually deduct the number of quarters that they have worked for this, with proof from the Social Security office. And the law is that there has to be 40 quarters of work from the Social Security office, or you deduct a portion of it. So essentially the 10 years is 40 quarters of work the Social Security office, or where you have Social Security evidence. And then let's say that there's been 5 years of work, then that means the affidavit of support will only be enforceable through 5 years. Also, if the parent of a child coming in has worked and has evidence from the Social Security office, then you can deduct the number of quarters in that respect. But then again, we get into the issues of what happens if there was a fake Social Security number, and what happens if there was no Social Security number but there was still work, and there's all kinds of issues in regards to that. But assuming that those issues don't exist, and that'll be a topic for another video, but assuming that they don't exist, then it would be a matter of deducting the number of qualified quarters worked by either the parent of someone under 18 or by the beneficiary who's over 18 but has worked the number of hours. Now, there are, I just want to throw in here, there are certain cases where an affidavit of support is not required. Now, remember, I said that it's for 10 years or until the person, the beneficiary, becomes a U.S. citizen. So generally, let's just say it's a spouse, a U.S. citizen spouse petitioning somebody. Well, if everything goes well, then the beneficiary can become a U.S. citizen 3 years after that, which means that the affidavit of support requirements will only be applicable for those 3 years. Well, there are cases, for example, where you're petitioning a child, and the law, based upon the Child Citizenship Act of 2001 and other laws combined, where the child essentially is a lawful permanent resident from the plane ride from their home country over to the U.S., and in the moment they step onto U.S. soil, they're a U.S. citizen. Okay, and that's also another topic for another video. But if the beneficiary, once they get into the United States, will be a U.S. citizen, then the affidavit of support is not required, because essentially, if it was required, you'd be saying, well, it's required from, leaving El Salvador on a plane for 10 hours to the United States, and then no longer it would be required. So that is essentially what would be required in that case. Now, there are other issues that we need to be concerned with the affidavit of support. And a lot of times the issue is that the sponsor does not make enough money, doesn't make at least 125% of the required poverty guidelines in order to do the affidavit of support, and so that the beneficiary is not considered a public charge. So there are things that we need to look at in order to not get around that, but to be able to properly submit the requirements so that the petition doesn't just get stopped without being able to go forward. Because sometimes you're waiting years and years and years to be able to come into the U.S., the visa number becomes current, and then, unfortunately, you're stopped at the final gate because the affidavit of support requirements are not met. So one thing that you also have to be aware of is the person who is the sponsor who's signing the affidavit of support must be over 18, must be a U.S. citizen or lawful permanent resident, must meet the poverty requirements, and must be domiciled inside the United States. So if you're a U.S. citizen living in Tahiti for the last 20 years, it won't work. You must be domiciled within the United States in order to make this happen. And one other small point, if it's an employment-based petition, you don't need an affidavit of support, an I-864, to be submitted with the application unless you, the beneficiary, own at least 5% or more of the company that is petitioning you. So for the most part, what we're really talking about here will be family-based petitions, and of course they're all required on there unless the exceptions that I've given above exist. Okay? Now, in the particular case of an affidavit of support, let's just say that a U.S. citizen husband petitions the wife. And let's say that the U.S. citizen husband does not make enough money under the poverty requirements. Well, you can then use household wage earners and file the I-864A, okay? And what that is somebody who lives essentially in the same household. They do not have to be a USC or a lawful permanent resident, and of course you have to make sure that the money comes from a lawful source, that it's lawful employment within the United States. So that is a bit of an issue, but assuming that it is lawful employment within the United States or comes from some other lawful source, then you can actually have their income counted along with the sponsor's income to aggregate it and show that there is sufficient income for the affidavit of support requirements. And again, it doesn't have to be the beneficiary. It could be, let's say you have a son that's 22 years old or 18 years old, whatever, that's been working. You can use that son's income as a household wage earner, aggregate it to the sponsor's wage to meet the 125% requirement. Now, there's another way. Let's say you don't have any household wage earners, or let's say that they, you do, but unfortunately the employment's not lawful. Well, in that case, you need to find a joint sponsor. Now, the thing about a joint sponsor is each joint sponsor must meet the poverty requirements by themselves, meaning that you can't take, let's say you need $22,800 to make the 125%, and let's say that the sponsor has 16,000, and if you add it up you need about another 8,000. You can't find somebody, a joint sponsor, that makes 9,000, add the two and say, okay, that qualifies it. No, you have to show that a joint sponsor makes 22,500 or whatever the minimum requirements are, and then they will be able to be a joint sponsor, and again they become jointly and severally liable along with the sponsor in the same manner as if they were the sponsor themselves. Now there is a way that you can actually have more joint sponsors, but keep in mind you can't have more than one joint sponsor per essentially per beneficiary. So if you're bringing in, for example, 2 or 3 beneficiaries and the joint sponsor only makes sufficient for one of them, you can actually bring in another joint sponsor to aggregate or to show that they can sponsor one of the children, for example. So you can basically have 2 joint sponsors for any particular family group. Okay, so that's how that works. Now, if the petitioner dies, essentially you have to do a whole humanitarian reinstatement, which I have other videos on, but you can obtain a substitute sponsor who's not the petitioner in order to go forward. Okay, now there are certain other petitions that do not need to have the affidavit of support, and some of those would be diversity immigrants, special immigrants, self-petitioning immigrants. You know, when the self-petitioning immigrants are widows and their spouses and children subject to extreme cruelty. Certain children, spouses and grandparents under the Patriot Act, various refugees and asylees adjusting status. It's also registry applicants. Basically, if you look at all of those together, essentially it's one person who's the petitioner, and there is no sponsor. They are the sponsor and the beneficiary. It's essentially the same person. And so it would be a little unfair or unrealistic to expect them to be able to go forward and show that they meet the requirements themselves. So keep that in mind when it's going forward. Now, as far as the issues here, let's say that you can't find a joint sponsor, and again, what we're talking about here is you don't have sufficient income in order to meet the minimum poverty requirements. So there's another way of trying to get around it, other than finding either a household wage earner or another joint sponsor. And one way is to show the assets that you own. So let's say that the sponsor is $5,000 short of income on showing the poverty requirements. Well, you can submit evidence that they own assets, you know, other bank accounts, stocks, bonds, CDs, other personal property, real estate, all of that. You can add it all up and you can show that if the property equals 5 times the amount that is needed, that will satisfy the affidavit of support requirement. So in my example, let's say again that they needed $5,000 or more of income to meet the poverty requirements. If they can show $25,000 in assets, and again, it doesn't have to be just real property, personal property, CDs, retirement, bank accounts, whatever, then you can show that they do meet the requirements, and that should be able to go forward to prove that the beneficiary will not become a public charge. Now, when you submit the affidavit of support, what documents do you need to verify it? Because you can't just put a number on the I-864 and expect, you know, immigration to believe it. So what you do is you submit the federal tax returns for the most recent year, including W-2 forms, and it used to be 3 years, but now it's just 1 year, and that will take care of that requirement. Evidence of current employment, and that's just, you know, a letter from your employer. If you're self-employed, prepare one stating what you do and you own the company, or if it's from an employment, have them just say what you do, how much you make, and how long you've worked there. It's quite easy and it's quite short. And then obviously the current edition you should have of the poverty requirements, so that you know how much you need to show. That table actually is updated yearly and will be on the instructions to or from the affidavit of the affidavit of support form. So as you can see, there's a lot of issues with the affidavit of support. Hopefully I've cleared some up, and again, understand it is an enforceable contract between you or the joint sponsor and the government, and from there it depending how much they can get back, you know, there's ways of fighting it and showing, because there's not every bit of government assistance that one goes on can be counted or reimbursed under the affidavit of support requirements. So if you happen to have any issues or need help with the affidavit of support, would like a consultation, then please give me a call or set up a time for a consultation. I'll be happy to help you out, and then we'll go from there. More in the coming video.